राम्रोसँग बुझेर अनि त्यसको मारबाट प्रभावबाट सबभन्दा बढी पीडित र प्रभावित जुन छन् तिनीहरूलाई बुझाउन सक्यौँ भने मात्रै यसले सार्थकता पाउँछ भनेर उहाँले भन्नुभएको थियो। तिनीहरूले सर्ट अफ भनौँ न डिमिस्टिफिकेसन डिजार्गनाइजेसन भन्नुभएको थियो, उहाँले त्यही शब्द गर्नुभएको थियो। त्यो चाहिँ द्याट्स भेरी इम्पोर्टेन्ट। खालि यो जार्गनहरू युज गरेर लिटरेचर बनाएर रिपोर्ट बनाएर यहाँ त्यहाँ गरेर हुनेवाला छैन। अब मुस्ताङमा डोल्पामा नपर्ने बेला किन पानी पर्यो, अब माटाको छाना भएका घरहरू धमाधम चाहिँ पग्लिएर भत्किन थाले। के हो त त्यहाँ गर्ने? उनीहरू अब एग्रिकल्चर चाहिँ माउन्टेन बेस्ड छ, माउन्टेन बेस्ड इकोसिस्टम, माउन्टेन इकोसिस्टम बेस्ड एग्रिकल्चर छ, त्यसलाई पनि फेरि क्लाइमेट चेन्जले इम्प्याक्ट गर्यो भनेपछि त्यहाँ त झन् दोहोरो मार पर्ने हो। त्यसै पनि भल्नरेबल थिए, झन् भल्नरेबल बनायो। त्यसलाई अब कसरी हो त्यो एड्रेस गर्ने? तिनीहरूले त्यो प्र्याक्टिकल्ली इम्प्लिमेन्टेबल इफेक्टिभ टुल्सहरू डेभलप गर्न सक्यौँ र अनि त्यहाँ गएर इम्प्लिमेन्ट गर्न सक्यौँ भने त्यसले लागि फरक पार्ला। होइन भने दिस विल बी लिमिटेड टु जङ्गल अफ जार्गन्स, यो माथि यो क्लाइमेट चेन्ज प्रोफेसनलहरूको डोमेनमा मात्रै यो सीमित रहन्छ भनेर उहाँले भन्नुभएको थियो। त्यो चाहिँ त्यत्तिकै महत्त्वपूर्ण छ जस्तो मलाई लाग्छ। त्यति भनेपछि अहिले म ऱ्याप अप गर्छु। दुईवटा चाहिँ टु सेट्स अफ च्यालेन्जेस द्याट आई थिङ्क वी हेभ बिन फेसिङ। द फर्स्ट सेट अफ च्यालेन्ज इन्भल्भ्स बिलोङ्स टु द इन्टरनल च्यालेन्जेस। यसमा चाहिँ के छ भने वी हेभ नट सो फार बिन इफेक्टिभ इन जेनेरेटिङ and substantiating the data that we require. त्यो चाहिँ हाम्रो विकनेस छ। मैले अहिले इन्स्टिट्युसनल फ्रन्टमा केही गरेका छौँ त भने, तर त्यो चाहिँ प्रोग्राम फर्मुलेसन र पोलिसी फर्मुलेसन, प्रोग्राम फर्मुलेसन र कोअर्डिनेसनको इन्स्टिट्युसन मेकानिजम हो। तर रिसर्च मेकानिजम, रिसर्च एन्ड डेभलपमेन्टको इन्स्टिट्युसनल मेकानिजम चाहिँ हामीसँग छैन। अब क्लाइमेट चेन्ज पोलिसीले क्लाइमेट चेन्ज सेन्टर बनाऊ भनेको छ, त्यो पनि हामीले बनाउन सकेका छैनौँ। त्यसलाई बेसिकल्ली त्यो आरएनडीकै काम दिने हिसाब हो। अनि क्लाइमेट चेन्ज फन्ड पनि अब किसिमले क्लाइमेट चेन्जको अथवा क्लाइमेट कहीँ भनौँ न क्लाइमेट रिसोर्स जुन आउँछ अब आइराखेको छ, त्यसलाई चाहिँ एउटै बास्केटमा राखेर कसरी इफेक्टिभली प्रोग्राम बेस्ड मोडालिटीमा च्यानलाइज गर्न सकिन्छ, त्यसलाई क्लाइमेट फन्ड बनाऊ, क्लाइमेट चेन्ज फन्ड बनाऊ भनेको छ, त्यो पनि हामीले बनाउन सकेका छैन। र अब यो नलेज म्यानेजमेन्ट र डेटा जेनेरेसनको लागि हामीले धेरै काम गर्नुपर्ने छ। त्यो हामीले गर्न सकेका छौँ। एउटा च्यालेन्ज चाहिँ त्यो छ। दोस्रो चाहिँ बेस्ड अन द फ्याक्ट्स एन्ड भनौँ न सब्सटेन्सिएटेड इभिडेन्सेस यु सुड बी एबल टु ड्र द एटेन्सन अफ द इन्टरनेसनल कम्युनिटी। अहिले चाहिँ कस्तो भने अरूले गरिदिएको अध्ययनमा अब नेपाल चाहिँ क्लाइमेट भल्नरेबल छ भनेर त्यही म्यापल क्रफ्टलाई भनिराख्नुपर्ने कि जहिले पनि। वी डोन्ट ह्याभ आवर ओन internally generated and substantiated data mechanism based on which we can very succinctly claim that look we have been vulnerable. माउन्टेनमा पनि त्यही इसिमोड एउटा छ, त्यसले अलिअलि डेटा जेनेरेट गरिदिएको छ। इसिमोड पनि नेपालको मात्रै होइन, 7वटा 8वटा चाहिँ हिन्दुस्तान म्यानेजमेन्टका कम्प्युटर हेर्ने हो। त्यस हुनाले हाम्रो आफ्नो चाहिँ नेसनल्ली ओन्ड र अपरेटेड एउटा रिसर्च एन्ड डेभलपमेन्ट मेकानिजम जसले डेटा जेनेरेट गर्छ र सब्सटेन्सिएट गर्छ भन्ने बित्तिकै त्यसको आधारमा हामीले इन्टरनेसनल कम्युनिटीको ध्यान आकर्षित गर्न सक्यौँ भने अनि रिसोर्स माग्न पनि अलिकति अलि लेजिटिमेट चाहिँ बेसिस चाहिँ तयार हुन्छ। त्यो एउटा हामीले गर्नुपर्ने छ। र अर्को चाहिँ स्थानीय तहमा चाहिँ अनुकूलन क्षमता वृद्धि भने चाहिँ एडाप्टिभ कपासिटी। अब हामी लग्न खोज्दैछौँ, लापा त्यही दृष्टिकोणबाट बनाएको हो। नेसनल एडाप्टेसन प्रोग्राम अफ एक्सनलाई प्लान अफ एक्सन बनाउने लोकल भनेर लापा हो भनेको। तर त्यो भर्खर सुरु गर्दैछौँ, त्यो बिस्तारै होला। अनि अर्को चाहिँ च्यालेन्ज भनेको त्यो इन्टरनल च्यालेन्जभित्र यो कोल्याबोरेसन इन रियल सेन्स अफ द टर्म, पार्टनरसिप। यो गभर्मेन्ट मात्र गरेर हुने कुरा छैन। अब गभर्मेन्ट भने पनि अमूर्त कुरा हो, त्यसमा गभर्मेन्ट भन्न साथै क्लाइमेट चेन्ज भनेको वातावरण मन्त्रालय बुझिन्छ, तर वातावरण मन्त्रालयले केही गर्न सक्छ। त्यसले गभर्मेन्ट द्याट मिन्स द कन्सर्न मिनिस्ट्रिज, the sectoral ministries and the system mechanism which exists outside the government, private sector भनौँ अथवा एनजिओ सिएसओ छैन, यो बिचमा यो दुईटा गभर्मेन्ट र नन गभर्मेन्टल सेक्टरको बिचमा चाहिँ कोल्याबोरेसन। अब यो यी 4वटा कुरा अहिले बेसिकल्ली अब इन्टरनल च्यालेन्जभित्र पर्छ भने अब एक्सटर्नल च्यालेन्ज भनौँ अथवा द च्यालेन्ज द्याट वी हेभ टु कोप विथ भिसाभिस द इन्टरनेसनल कम्युनिटी। त्यो भनेको चाहिँ एउटा माउन्टेन इनिसिएटिभ। अब यो चाहिँ के भने नेपाल मैले भन्ने गर्छु अब अहिले भर्खर क्लाइमेट चेन्जको कुरा गर्दा अथवा इन्भाइरोमेन्ट कही कुरा गर्दाखेरि पनि 2 platforms that we can optimize, we can build on and optimize. एउटा प्लेटफर्म चाहिँ माउन्टेन इनिसिएटिभ हो, हामीले इन्टरनेसनल कन्फरेन्स पनि गऱ्यौँ. वी रिलेटिभली सक्सेसफुल्ली हेल्ड द कन्फरेन्स अप्रिलमा, र त्यसले काठमाडौँ कल फर एक्सन चाहिँ एडप्ट गरेको छ. इट्स अ 10-point डिक्लेरेसन विच कल्स फर among other things creating a dedicated fund for the mountain countries to confront with the negative impacts of climate change. Mountain countries means all set of countries, developed, developing, least developed. यदि एउटा फन्ड चाहियो त्यो भनेको छ, र त्यसपछि एउटा ग्लोबल नेचर वर्क प्रोग्राम बनाऊ, र अर्को चाहिँ रेस्पेक्टिभ नेसनल एक्सन प्लान बनाऊ. भनेपछि प्रोग्राम अफ वर्क एट द ग्लोबल लेभल, एक्सन प्लान एट द नेसनल लेभल, त्यो बनाऊ भनेर त्यसमा भनिएको छ अमङ अदर थिङ्स होइन. अब त्यसलाई चाहिँ अब फर्दर भनौँ न, त्यसलाई चाहिँ स्ट्रिमलाइन गरेर सब्स्ट्यान्सिएट गरेर इन्टरनेसनल कम्युनिटीमा पुर्याउनु पर्ने, त्यो एउटा छ. र अर्को चाहिँ अब हाम्रो इन्टरनेसनल क्लाइमेट चेन्ज नेगोसिएसन फोरममा आफ्नो प्रेजेन्सलाई स्ट्रेन्थन गर्ने कुरा हो, जसको लागि हामी यो CNT फर्म गऱ्यौँ, र अब ओरिएन्टेसन आज हामी ओरिएन्टेसनको सिरिज सुरु गर्दैछौँ. ओरिएन्टेसन आज चाहिँ दिस इज द बिगिनिङ अफ द सिरिज. र अनि अर्को चाहिँ अब LDC को हो. अब अर्को प्लेटफर्म चाहिँ LDC को प्लेटफर्म, त्यसले द्याट पुट्स च्यालेन्जेस एज वेल एज अपर्च्युनिटिज बिफोर अस. र त्यसलाई हामीले जुडिसियसली जुन हदसम्म जस्टिस दिन सकिन्छ हामीले पाएको त्यो अपर्च्युनिटीलाई त्यो हदसम्म युटिलाइज गर्ने र रोल प्ले गर्ने त्यो हो. र अब यी दुईटै इन्टरनल र भनौँ न एक्सटर्नल दुईटै च्यालेन्जको लागि चाहिँ मैले भनिहालेँ, एक्लै केही गर्न सक्दैन र गर्न पनि हुँदैन. त्यसको लागि अब यो जुन कोल्याबोरेसनको जुन कुरा गरेको छु मैले, यो चाहिँ कस्तो भने दिस कन्सेप्ट इज बेस्ड अन द कन्सेप्ट अफ फर्मिङ एन्ड द इफेक्टिभाइजिङ द कन्ट्री टिम. यो चाहिँ यो गभर्मेन्ट टिम पनि होइन. द्याट इज वाइ वी द पिपल फ्रम आउटसाइड अफ द गभर्मेन्ट आर अल्सो हियर. त्यस कारण यो कन्ट्री टिमलाई अझ भनौँ न, यसलाई अझ इफेक्टिभ बनाउने सन्दर्भमा खालि यो साइज र नम्बर मात्रै इन्लाज गर्ने कुरा होइन, त्यो पनि गरौँला. र मैले के पनि भनिरहेको छु भने बेस्ड अन द पर्फर्मेन्स द्याट इच अफ द member in the team will be playing, will be showing during the upcoming negotiations, will be reconstituting the team. त्यो पनि हामी हेर्छौँ कसको पर्फर्मेन्स कस्तो हुन्छ र कसले कसरी उसले आफैले पनि मूल्याङ्कन गर्ला, त्यो आधारमा हामी टिमलाई स्ट्रेन्थन गर्दै लैजान्छौँ. Of course, I will be thanking Ian at the end of the day, at the end of the 3-day session, but my thanks are in advance to you. And you have actually very convincingly put your remarks, as I said, as a curtain raiser. And my thanks are also to Madhuraman sir. Basically, he is here on my request as the session facilitator. And I have also requested the other ambassador who was based in Geneva. I wanted these two people, the very important resource persons from two important seats of multilateral negotiations, Geneva and New York. Geneva को चाहिँ डक्टर दिनेश खत्री हुनुहुन्छ र सबैलाई म धन्यवाद दिन्छु र मेरो भनाइ चाहिँ यही सक्छु. धन्यवाद.
Okay, what I want to do is, as a point of introduction, is to give you an idea about negotiations in the context of the UN and the process that's involved with that. So in the UN, there are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations. So we're part of that group, a part of the United Nations. Anybody tell me what the last, now ambassadors are allowed to speak on this one, the last UN country? South Sudan. That's right, yes. So it came into being in 2011. So what's that in practical terms? So in the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen, there were 6 countries that didn't support the Copenhagen Accord. That was enough for the chair to say, we don't have consensus. And therefore we had to find some other means of acknowledging the Copenhagen Accord. At the last climate change meeting in Durban, no, in the one before last in Mexico, Bolivia did not support the final outcome of the meeting. Nevertheless, the chair adopted the outcome as consensus. So here we have one country objecting, and the chair considered that this was sufficient support that they consider consensus. So that's the sort of difference. And it's up to the chair to decide what he or she thinks is the consensus in that process. So it's a little bit different. So this is a crucial thing we have to think about in negotiations, is that we have to get everybody to agree to whatever outcome we want. Therefore, we have to give something for everybody. Everybody has to get something out of the deal, and that's usually some sort of package of a decision and outcome where everybody agrees. So that this is, we're working to the lowest common denominator by working on consensus basis. Because by getting everybody to agree, we're not getting the best outcomes. And to some extent, in some issues that's true, in some issues it's not. I mean, clearly there are a couple of international environmental agreements where voting is allowed. The Whaling Convention is one of those, and the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species is another, where they have a voting procedure, where countries put forward a nomination of an animal or species and they vote whether to support it to be listed on the convention or not. So is that a better system than consensus? Well, of course, in the Whaling Convention issue, it means that the countries who lose their vote may not wish to support the outcome. And perhaps a consensus decision would have been is a better process. Of course, there are also accusations that countries buy votes, and that's been, there have been suggestions of that in the Whaling Convention as well, where countries have sort of been accused of buying votes. So it's a complicated process. Mainly, though, in the Climate Change Convention, we work on a consensus basis. So we have to remind ourselves that we have to come up with outcomes that everybody can support. Within the UN system, within the context of international law, there is what's called a hierarchy of agreements. Some are things that are really binding on countries and some that are not so binding. So the non-binding agreements are generally what's called soft law, and basically they're agreements where countries get together and agree on some sort of outcome. So the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation, which was the 10-year review of the Rio Earth Summit, came out with a document which all countries agreed on, but it wasn't required any sort of legal ratification process. So that's sort of called a soft law outcome or a non-legally binding outcome. The most recent Rio conference, Rio Plus 20, had a document which again was one of these sort of documents which is a non-legally binding outcome. Then you have resolutions sort of moving along the spectrum of sort of being legally enforceable. Is the next one along is your UN General Assembly resolutions. Each year the UN General Assembly meets between September through till December, and they work on a series of resolutions passed by governments. There's one each year on climate change, so currently the UN General Assembly is reviewing a new resolution on climate change. In fact, the Climate Change Convention came about as an agreement through a UN General Assembly resolution. So the UN General Assembly said, yes, the issue of climate change is a serious concern. We, member governments of the UN, agreed to start a negotiation of a climate convention. So that bound countries to start negotiating an international agreement.
I think when we decide consensus, there is always a critical mass. that is required to say that. There may be few people. For example, in Tuvalu, Copenhagen Accord 2009, Tuvalu opposed Copenhagen Accord, but it was still adopted because the critical mass was for a consensus. So adopted in the sense took note of it. They did not.
Well, yeah, but we didn't adopt it.
I'll come back.
Yeah, we then had to find some new words which we could all agree by consensus. And the words were, you know, we all went into a small huddle at the front of the room, and we came up with the words. We took note of the Copenhagen Accord, and that we had consensus on. We moved forward based on that decision. So we've had you know, outcomes like the COP in Cancun, where we had all countries agree to an outcome towards a process of moving forward, and one country objected. What we're doing is we're moving forward based on that COP decision. Occasionally we're reminded by Bolivia, which is the country that objected, that they didn't agree on this. It's very hard to define this because it is this sort of grey area of international law, that what is a COP decision? Is it legally binding on everybody, you know, if you agree to it? Or what happens if you don't are bound by that agreement? But you know, it depends really. It's a sort of, the general view is that we implement that COP decision.
And there are also frequent writings on the outcome and the agreement. For example, Cancun agreement or Cancun outcome. I think these two words are different, agreement and outcome.
Yes, but they were basically the COP decision. That was 1 CP17. So that was just a name for that COP decision. And sometimes, well, that was the COP outcome was all the decisions that were made at the COP. The COP agreement was decision 1 CP7. So it was sort of the collective group of decisions that were made in Cancun were called the Cancun outcome. So that related to the Kyoto Protocol as well as the COP. So that was called the Cancun outcome. And then you had the Cancun agreement, which was really one decision. That was 1 CP17. 16, sorry, yes. So we move into that, you know, the COP, we have agreement of the agreement, and then we implement it by COP decisions, and we implement that. And we'll work into this, what it means by doing that. To get to COP decisions, we go through a series of meetings. And so I want to explain what these meetings are, because they get very confusing at times. And this is one of the most difficult things in following a COP process, is the following what the meetings are that go on. So we start off generally in what's called a plenary, which is the meeting of all the countries that get together in some big meeting hall. So this is COP13 in Bali. Big meeting room, all the countries are represented in this meeting room, and it's and people can speak in any of the 6 UN languages. So there's translation in the 6 UN languages. What are the 6 UN languages? Yeah. So we got English, French, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Arabic. Yes. So that's the 6 UN languages. The meeting once the plenary opens for the agenda, we discuss the agenda, we agree on the agenda for the meeting, and then for each agenda item, the meeting gets broken off into a contact group. Generally, this is the process. So this is where you actually negotiate a decision of that agenda item. And it might be, for instance, the funding for least developed countries is an agenda item, or a regular agenda item on the COP. So we go into a small room, and you can see this is a contact group here, your country nameplates are sort of in a pile on the table in front of you. You have to grab your nameplate and find a seat at the table. There's nowhere reserved for you. So you have to fight to find a seat at the table. See, this person, whoever this is, that's Kenya, missed out on a seat around the main table. So this is a crucial thing, is to get there early to get your seat at the table. And so we start negotiating COP decisions in contact groups. Now, contact groups are open to observers. And so there's, non-government organisations, UN agencies, etc., can sit in. Usually they sit in around the back and watch the proceedings. Now, there's a general rule within the climate change negotiations that more than two contact groups can meet at the same time. And the reason for that is for countries that have small delegations so they can follow the whole process. To get around that rule, they form what is called informal groups. So this is where you go into a sort of another negotiation, usually again in a small room. And you can see here people are sitting around and there's a projection screen where they project up text, the COP decision that we're working on. And this is where you get into real negotiations, word by word, in these informal groups. The problem with these informal meetings is that they're not shown on the daily program. Every day you get a schedule of meetings for the day, and those informal groups are not shown on the daily program because they don't formally exist. So this is where you have to be on the ball to know where these meetings are going to be held. Usually there's a sort of notification sent to the chair of the coordinating groups. So the chair of the least developed countries will be informed by the Secretariat of where informal groups will be held. But there's nothing formally presented on the daily program. And this is where it gets a challenge, because there's usually a lot of informal groups held at the same time. So it gets around this rule of only not having more than 2 meetings at the same time. So this is where coordinating the process of people attending this is crucial. And this is a key role of a facilitator of the group, like the LDC group, to make sure that all the informal groups have got an LDC representative in that discussion, wherever it might be occurring. So that's the crucial role of facilitation of a coordinator, is to make sure that we have somebody at each one of these informal groups representing the LDC viewpoint. And so then we might go into what's called a Friends of the Chair group. So this is a subgroup, or we might sometimes we might have an informal group, or even an informal group. So there might be something within that decision. It might be a long decision on LDCs, and there might be one element of that decision that another spin-off group or another informal group will be formed to talk about maybe the funding issues. And another group might be talking about the design of national adaptation plans. There are 2 groups that have spun off from this one outcome. And so that's called an informal group. You might also have what's called a Friends of the Chair. The chair who's facilitating the contact group or the informal group might say, there might be a real debate over one paragraph. And I've been in long negotiations over sentences, one sentence, that countries just cannot agree upon. And the chair might say, okay, I'm going to form a Friends of the Chair group and nominate the countries, the key countries that are being involved in negotiations. And I said, I want you to go to somewhere else, and I want you to come back to me with an agreement on that one sentence, or it might be a paragraph. So this is a sort of subgroup just working on maybe a paragraph or a sentence. And that's called Friends of the Chair. And the Friends of the Chair go off, they work out the outcomes and then come back to another negotiation. So does that make sense? So you can have a regional group consultation. Often the group of 77, the G77 countries, will say, we need to consult. We don't have a common position on this issue, we need to consult. And they will go off and consult. And so this picture here is the chair of the subsidiary body on implementation last year, meeting with a group of 77. So there's some prominent people, a woman from Venezuela there. So this is meeting with a sort of regional group to try and see whether if there's a blockage by one of the groups, and I'll discuss the different sort of groups in the next session. So this is how it looks schematically, I guess. We start with a COP, we have a plenary, all the countries are represented. It might split into working groups. Usually the Biodiversity Convention works on working groups, they're split into 2. Then we'll go into a contact group where you start negotiations where observers are allowed, and then that'll break off into an informal group. And then, if there's sort of no agreement within the formal group, we might have a Friends of the Chair. They'll agree on some words, they'll bring that back to the informal group. The informal group will have to refer back to the contact group, their outcomes, and then the contact group comes back to the plenary with a final conclusion. Generally, once it's gone through that full process, once the decision comes back to the COP plenary, the chair of the COP plenary is very reluctant to open up the negotiations again. Occasionally it happens, but generally the chair is very reluctant because it's gone through all these sorts of processes to get an agreement. Of course, the trouble is that not everybody, if you've got a small delegation, you can't go to every informal group that occurs on all issues. And so you might feel that when you come back to the COP plenary where everybody has to agree, you've missed out on the negotiations. So that's what happened in Copenhagen to some extent. The small ministerial meeting or heads of government meeting that occurred was only a select number of heads of government. In the case, Tuvalu had their Prime Minister, we weren't invited into that session. So we had to decide, once we consulted, whether we could support that. And that's why we had to not agree to the Copenhagen Accord back in a plenary session. So does that make sense to people? Yeah.
Sometimes there are also spin-off groups.
Yes.
Where do they fit in?
Spin-off groups is generally another word for informal groups. It's just another term for informal groups. But they don't formally exist. Not like a contact group. They're called spin-off groups. There's another terminology used. Yeah. Yeah.
There is informal group and informal. And again informal, and informal.
Yes.
So what is the difference between these two? Three informal, two informal, and one informal.
And have an informal group to deal with one issue within that broader decision. So if we're looking at the outcomes of the Durban platform, which is a big decision, looking at a mandate to consider a new legally binding agreement, there might be elements within that you would split off to an informal group. Difficult for small delegations to cover all these subgroups, and it's difficult. Yeah.
Any intervention that we will make in the COP plenary and the working group, they are recorded as a country position, yes?
Yes.
But when we enter to the informal group, those positions are not recorded. It's a type of discussion.
Yes, that's right. There's no formal record of your country's position in that regard. Of course, in a contact group, when you've got observers, then the observers can record what you've said and put it out in the Eco magazine or other forms. And also Earth Negotiations Bulletin will record within a contact group. Generally, they'll attribute the country that said something. Sometimes the chair will say, no, they can't. So they might say it in one large developing country said this without actually explaining who it is that said it. So you've got to sort of work out who it is that said it.
Most of the things happen in between informal groups, right?
Most of the crucial negotiations occur in informal groups.
Yeah.
That's where you really get down to negotiating word for word a COP decision. And we've had, debates over the commas and semicolons. After the Bali COP, COP 13, I was sitting at the airport waiting to leave, and an NGO came up to me and said to me, I hear you're responsible for the semicolon in the decision on RED, reducing emissions from deforestation. So that's my claim to fame, a semicolon in the decision on reducing emissions from deforestation. So if you've got problems with that semicolon, you can blame me. Okay? You have to look at the Bali action plan and see where the semicolon is, and so that's how it works.
And we have one more question. Why sometimes the whole session is named informal session, as for example, the Bangkok session last time? It was called the conversation on AWZKP, LCA, and W platform. So, why it is named informal?
Procedurally, it's called informal because it hasn't been agreed by the COP. So there was no agreement in the COP back in Durban to have a negotiating session in Bangkok. So there's no formal mandate to negotiate, but the Bureau, which is the sort of the management committee of the COP, which is made up of representatives of governments, decided to have another negotiation. So it can't be a formal negotiation, and therefore it's called an informal. And so the outcomes of that discussion are not formally reported, but they guide the process towards the next meeting, which is a formal meeting, which will be the next COP. So that's why it's called an informal negotiating session.
My question is, by some way, if the delegate from Nepal didn't appear in the meeting and they didn't find some information and they found later, can they complain about it and just disagree on that letter? Or once it is done, it's done? They don't have any provision to complain or talk about it themselves.
Well, yeah, if they're there at the COP meeting and they've missed a negotiation, theoretically they can, when you get it back to the COP plenary, that's where all parties have to agree on the decision. So they can say, we weren't part of that earlier discussion, therefore we can't agree with it. And depending on the chair, whether the chair thinks that view is a valid view, that chair might reopen it again for discussion. But it's again up to the chair to decide that. Usually it's best, if you're in that situation, to find other countries that are in a similar situation and build up enough countries that'll break the consensus, I guess. But if it's just one country, they'll say, well, look, can you live with this? And there'll be a lot of pressure put on you to accept the consensus. And again, it's up to the chair to decide that.
But they often refer as one of the veteran negotiators said something like this.
Well, they say one of the seasoned negotiators. If you see the word, or one of the veteran negotiations or seasoned negotiators, it could be me. Yes.
You have mentioned the working group. Where the subsidiary body lie? Subsidiary body.
Okay. Well, this is yes. So the COP has different forms, and I'll look at those again in the formation of the different groups when we get into the groups. But so the COP is the Conference of Parties. Then you have all the parties who have ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So that's the Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of parties, or sometimes called COPMOP. And then the convention and the Kyoto Protocol have what's called subsidiary bodies. And we have a subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, SUBSTA, and the subsidiary body on implementation. They usually deal with the sort of financial issues. And then we have the ad hoc working groups, which are also subsidiary bodies under the convention. And so they each have their agendas for the meeting. So when we go to a COP, we've got an agenda for the COP, we've got an agenda for the COPMOP, we've got an agenda for the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, we've got an agenda for the subsidiary body on implementation, and for this coming COP we'll have an agenda for the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action. We'll also have an agenda for the ad hoc working group on the review of Annex 1 commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, and then we'll have another agenda for the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform. So we have 7 meetings going on at once at the next COP. And there'll be agendas for each one of those. So that's within that process, and there are some people whose personalities are stronger than their governments, I guess. And so we have some very strong personalities in the negotiation process. There's a woman from the Philippines who's a very strong character in the climate change negotiations.
My focus it will be on politics of negotiations around climate change and nuances of multilateral negotiation and how we prepare about this. These are the 3 main points that I want to cover. The mathiko cover climate change is a contested political issue. Sabanda पहिलो यहाँ मानिसहरुले धेरै कुरा के थाहा छैन climate change has now moved from science to politics. पहिला साइन्समा there is convergence. किनभने साइन्टिफिक डिबेट जति पनि थियो आईपीसीसी का रिपोर्ट आए साइन्सहरुले त्यहाँ चाहिँ कति क्लाइमेट चेन्ज हो कि हैन रियल छ कि छैन त्यसो एन्थ्रोपोजेनिक कजेसहरु छ कि छैन भन्ने बारेमा जुन थियो त्यो इट्स कन्भर्जेन्स. नाउ वी आर मुभिङ टु पोलिटिक्स पोलिसी एन्ड प्र्याक्टिसेस. त्यसमा हामी मुभ गरिरहेका छौँ र अहिले जुन हाम्रो क्लाइमेट चेन्ज जुन गइरहेछ why it is political? Because it requires a fundamental transformation of economic, environmental, social equity practices. It requires big change of the order. It will change the way we work, the way we define our political, even economic and development paradigms. That is why it's political. If what we are अहिले जुन गर्ने भनिराखेको छ त्यो गर्ने भनेर जुन हामी एउटा चाहिँ न्यू क्लाइमेट रेजिममा जाने भनिरहेको छ त्यो रेजिममा जाँदाखेरि देयर विल बी अ बिग न्यू अर्डर इन द मेकिङ र नेगोसिएसन अबाउट फ्युचर क्लाइमेट चेन्ज भन्नु चाहिँ इट्स नट जस्ट नेगोसिएसन अबाउट क्लाइमेट, इट्स नेगोसिएसन अबाउट फ्युचर इकोनोमिक एन्ड डेभलपमेन्ट प्याराडाइम पनि भएको हुनाले देयर इज अ लट अफ पोलिटिक्स अराउन्ड इट. of energy use, new types of ecosystem accounting, new types of biodiversity, or everything we do, it will be changing. All disagreements or agreements in this case have political dimension. That's why yes sir. यहाँ अघि कुरा भइसक्यो कि लिगल फ्रेमवर्क हाम्रो जुन हामी नेगोसिएसन गर्न गइरहेका छौँ त्यो म यस बारेमा धेरै दोहोऱ्याए आई वोन्ट रिपिट इट. तर युएन फ्रेमवर्क कन्भेन्सन अन क्लाइमेट चेन्ज दिस इज द लिगल बेसिस. तर त्यो चाहिँ एउटा ओन्ली फ्रेमवर्क हो. इट डिड नट प्रोभाइड एनी कङ्क्रिट कमिटमेन्ट्स और एनी पोलिसी अब्लिगेसन थिएन त्यसमा स्टेटमा. खालि वाट इट क्रिएटेड अ सब्सिडियरी प्र्याक्टिसेस एन्ड अ कन्फरेन्स अफ पार्टिज जुन चाहिँ नि अहिले हामीले स्कोप अथवा सिओपी कोप पनि भन्छ सिओपी भन्छ कोप जुन क्रिएट गरेर त्यो अन्तर्गत हामी अहिले गरिरहेको छौँ. र यसको चाहिँ यो पछाडिको चाहिँ एउटा बाइन्डिङ भनेको जुनको भने क्योटो प्रोटोकल द इन्टरनेसनली लिगली बाइन्डिङ प्रोटोकल ट्रिटी 1997 थियो. त्यसमा चाहिँ कङ्क्रिट कमिटमेन्ट थियो, बाइन्डिङ टार्गेट्स फर इन्डस्ट्रियलाइज कन्ट्रिज एन्ड एक्सपोर्ट कन्ट्रिज र कन्ट्रिज इन ट्रान्जिसन त्यो अन्टिल 2012 को कमिटमेन्टहरूमा भएको र मेकानिजम फर ट्रेडिङ एमिसन रिडक्सन इन्भेस्टमेन्ट इन क्लिन डेभलपमेन्ट एउटा थियो जुन कुरो तपाईँहरूले धेरै थाहा पाइसक्नु भएको छ. र यसको अहिले के छ भन्दाखेरि अब म आई विल कम ब्याक टु दिस. यो चाहिँ नि यो वर्ष अब 2012 मा यसको चाहिँ नि एन्ड भयो भने सेकेन्ड कमिटमेन्ट पिरियडको कुरा छ जुन कुरा चाहिँ म पछाडि आउँछु. पछाडि अरू नगएर कोपेनहेगनबाट सुरु गर्नुपर्ने किन हुन्छ भने कोपेनहेगन वाज ल्यान्डमार्क जुन कोप 15 थियो. त्यसमा चाहिँ पोलिटिकल डाइमेन्सन यसको के थियो भने इट ब्रट मेन एक्टर्स इन्टु द प्ले पहिला who were otherwise little bit hesitant or did not want to be part of that process but were not non-committal about this process. One is the US. US is not a party to protocol, it was mentioned, but it was an active participant and negotiator in COP15. र अन्तिममा जुन लास्टको कोपेनहेगन एक्कर्ड बनेको त्यो बाराक ओबामा स्वयं पनि बसेर 4वटा कन्ट्रीको बिचमा चाहिँ नेगोसिएसन भएर निकालिएको एग्रिमेन्ट थियो र त्यो के थियो भने अन्टिल दिस टाइम र अहिले पनि अलिकति छ पोलिटिक्स रिफ्युजल अफ डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिज टु मेक बाइन्डिङ कमिटमेन्ट त्यसको पछाडि कारण छ डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिजहरू बाइन्डिङ कमिटमेन्ट गर्न किन मानिरहेछन् भने त्यो दिस इज फर समथिङ फर डेभलप्ड कन्ट्रिज टु डु किनभने दे पास थ्रु दिस फिजेस उनीहरूको डेभलपमेन्टको फेजमा दे आर द पोल्युटर्स दे हेभ द क्यापेबिलिटी सो त्यो गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने चाहिँ भनाइ भावना त्यसको अराउन्ड पोलिटिक्स छ र यो कोपेनहेगन पछाडि चाहिँ एउटा के नयाँ इमर्ज भयो भने जुन इन्टर गभर्मेन्टल प्यानल फर क्लाइमेट चेन्ज छ आइपिसिसीको रिपोर्टहरू जुन आउँथ्यो र त्यसको पछाडि त्यसको साइन्स आइपिसिसीको साइन्स एन्ड इट्स एमिसन रिडक्सन टार्गेटको बारेमा पोलिटिकल सपोर्ट त्यहाँ जेनेरेट भयो यहाँ चाहिँ नयाँ एउटा के डेभलप गर्यो भने अलाउड द कन्ट्रिज टु सेट देयर ओन नेसनल टार्गेट्स त्यहाँ दुईवटा कन्ट्रोभर्सी थियो कि बटम अप एप्रोच गर्ने कि टप डाउन एप्रोचहरू बटम अप भनेको द कन्ट्रिज सेट देयर टार्गेट्स and which is built into a comprehensive legally binding treaty ma or top down भने चाहिँ you create a target in the treaty which is broken down into countries यसमा चाहिँ अलिकति bottom up approach मा अलिकति एउटा नयाँ आयो हैन र यो सस्टेनेटिभ फाइनान्सको कमिटमेन्ट पनि थियो त्यहाँ यसको अराउन्ड ठुलो पोलिटिक्स छ किनभने त्यहाँ चाहिँ 30 बिलियन 10 देखि 12 सम्म र 100 बिलियन 2020 सम्मको लागि यो गरिएको थियो अप टु इज कोप 18 दोहा त्यहाँ चाहिँ मेजर फोकस चाहिँ के हुन्छ भने यो पार्टी टु क्योटो प्रोटोकल एज वेल एज डर्बान प्लेटफर्म फर इन्हान्स एक्सन भन्ने यो दुईटाको चाहिँ मेजर छ यसको बारेमा म अलिकति आउँछु यसमा अलिकति लङ टर्म कोअपरेटिभ एक्सन जुन एग्रिड भएको छ त्यसको नेगोसिएसन स्टार्ट हुने हो र त्यसमा चाहिँ एनहान्स नेसनल एक्सन अन इमिसन रिडक्सन यो एजेन्डामा यी इस्युजहरू छ अहिले कि अहिले जति गरिरहेको छ त्योभन्दा बढी कति गर्ने एनहान्स एक्सन अन एडप्टेसन एनहान्स एक्सन अन टेक्नोलोजी ट्रान्सफर अन फाइनेन्सिङ र एउटा वर्किङ ग्रुपको अर्गनाइजेसन वर्क इत्यादि एकदमै कुराहरू बाँकी छ यो अलिकति म पछाडि आउँछु यसमा तपाईँलाई कम्प्लिट लाग्ला अब यहाँ अहिले के छ कि टु ट्र्याक नेगोसिएसन प्रोसेस छ अहिले क्लाइमेट चेन्जमा एउटा जुन क्योटो ट्र्याक भन्छ जसमा चाहिँ अघि मैले भने सेकेन्ड कमिटमेन्ट पिरियड त्यो सेकेन्ड कमिटमेन्ट पिरियड 2005 मा लन्च भयो हो तर अब यो 2012 मा सकिएको हुनाले यो के अरे अब यो अहिले अनसर्टेन हो किनभने त्यति कमिटमेन्ट डेभलप्ड कन्ट्रीबाट छैन एउटा कुरो यो सेकेन्ड ट्र्याक लन्च गर्नलाई नि पहिले उनीहरू रिलक्टेन्स देखाएको थियो बल्ल बल्ल गरेर पनि यसमा चाहिँ नि कहिले नेगोसिएसन सकिने भन्ने पनि छैन त्यसपछि त्यसको सेकेन्ड कमिटमेन्ट पिरियड कहिलेसम्म जाने 5 वर्ष जाने कि 7 वर्ष जाने कि भन्ने पनि ठेगान छैन त्यसकारणले यो एउटा चाहिँ नि बिग पोलिटिकल इस्यु छ अर्को चाहिँ